Grace pushed open the bakery's familiar red door, a bell ringing overhead with a chime that tugged at her memory. The smell hit her first, warm cinnamon, sugar, and the faintest hint of vanilla. She had practically grown up here, surrounded by her grandmother's laughter and the sounds of mixers whirring, timers dinging, and customers chatting over coffee. But today, the bakery was still and silent, like it was holding its breath, waiting for her. Hi there. I'm Goldie, and welcome to Goldie's Love Stories. Everything looked just as it always had. The pastry cases gleamed, and the walls were adorned with old family photos, each one capturing a moment in time. But now, without her grandmother bustling around, it all felt different. The space, usually so alive, seemed frozen in time. And as Grace walked deeper into the bakery, a single question echoed in her mind: can I really do this? She had inherited her grandmother's bakery a week ago, and ever since then, a mixture of nostalgia and unease had settled in her chest. Grace had left her childhood town years ago to pursue a fast-paced career in the city. Baking had always been a weekend passion, a hobby she could shelve when things got busy. But now, the bakery was her responsibility. Its success or failure depended on her. Bracing herself, she stepped into the back room to go through her grandmother's belongings, the last task she'd been putting off. Boxes were stacked everywhere, each one packed with decades of memories and treasures. She moved through them carefully until her hand brushed something unusual. At the bottom of one box was a slim, worn leather book, the cover slightly cracked and soft from years of handling. Grace opened it gingerly and felt her heart skip a beat. It was a recipe book, her grandmother's recipe book, with everything from crusty bread loaves to delicate cream puffs documented in her familiar, flowing handwriting. She thumbed through the pages, marveling at each recipe until she reached a peculiar entry near the back titled, Family Secret Recipe. Unlike the others, this one was odd. The instructions were cryptic, filled with phrases like a pinch of joy and a dash of patience. Grace squinted, trying to decipher it. It seemed more like poetry than an actual recipe. Still, she felt an electric thrill. Her grandmother had always been mysterious about certain recipes, winking as she'd say, "One day you'll know." Was this what she had meant? Grace felt a surge of excitement, but just as quickly, doubt crept in. Could she handle this? Her grandmother had run this bakery with such ease, charming everyone in town. But Grace was, well, she was just Grace. Her baking skills were decent, but running a bakery was so much more than just baking. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in her mind, laughing as if to say, "You're not just Grace. You're exactly where you're meant to be." That thought stirred something within her, a blend of longing and determination. With a steadying breath, Grace made a decision. She'd try the recipe, even if it was nothing more than a whimsical poem. She would dive in and give this bakery everything she had, honoring her grandmother's legacy the only way she knew how. After all, if she didn't try, she'd never know. She pulled on an apron, tied her hair back, and got to work, glancing down at the recipe and doing her best to interpret its quirky instructions. "A pinch of joy," she murmured, adding a splash of vanilla with a smile, imagining her grandmother's laughter in the background. The process felt almost magical, as if she were summoning her grandmother's spirit with every stir and fold. The hours slipped away, each movement filling her with a strange confidence. By the time the dough was ready to bake, Grace felt a spark of pride she hadn't expected. She slid the tray into the oven, watching as the dough transformed, puffing up with promise. The smell that filled the kitchen was different from anything she'd ever made, warm, rich, and almost enchanting. When she pulled the tray out and set the pastries on the counter, Grace held her breath. They were golden brown, slightly crisp around the edges, just as her grandmother would have wanted. With a trembling hand, she broke one open and took a bite. A flood of flavors washed over her, unexpected and beautiful, as if her grandmother had crafted a message within the layers of pastry. In that moment, Grace knew. This was exactly where she was supposed to be. For the first time, Grace didn't feel like she was chasing someone else's legacy. She was creating her own. The next morning, she opened the bakery's doors, still unsure if anyone would come. But slowly, familiar faces trickled in, neighbors, childhood friends, loyal customers who had loved her grandmother's baking for years. They'd buy a pastry or two, give her a polite smile, but Grace could feel their disappointment. "These are nice," Mrs. Thompson had said yesterday, her eyes searching Grace's with a hint of encouragement. Grace knew nice wasn't enough. These were people who remembered the bakery's glory days, and they weren't ready to accept anything less. Determined to improve, Grace spent hours poring over the recipe book, especially over the cryptic family secret recipe. Her initial excitement at finding the recipe had worn thin, replaced by frustration as she struggled to interpret its quirky instructions. A pinch of joy, a sprinkle of dreams. The romantic language felt out of place among recipes that needed precision, not poetry. One morning, Grace noticed a line in the recipe she'd skimmed over before, with ingredients from afar, magic unfolds. She frowned. Ingredients from afar? She hadn't given much thought to the source of her ingredients, but she remembered her grandmother's stories of traveling to special markets for rare spices and ingredients. Realization dawned. Maybe her grandmother had crafted these pastries with ingredients not readily available at the local market. That would explain why her own attempts, though close, still fell short. After researching, Grace found a specialty distributor who carried rare ingredients, including a delicate vanilla grown in a remote region and a unique saffron that reportedly lent pastries a rich, golden hue. She placed an order, wincing as the total climbed. Between the rent, utilities, and ingredient costs, her savings were dwindling fast. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. As the days passed, Grace threw herself into experimenting with the secret recipe, but each batch seemed to fall just shy of capturing her grandmother's magic. One afternoon, frazzled and weary, she measured out a handful of spices, lost in thought. Her mind was so clouded with worries that she accidentally mixed an unusual blend of ingredients, a pinch of cinnamon, a dusting of cardamom, and a few drops of rosewater. Realizing the mistake, she almost threw the batch away but stopped herself, reasoning that she might as well see what happened. The aroma that filled the kitchen as the pastries baked was different from anything she'd smelled before, warm, floral, and comforting. When the timer dinged, Grace removed the tray, eyeing the pastries with skepticism. They had a golden hue, slightly crisp edges, and a glossy sheen that almost seemed to invite a taste. Tentatively, she took a bite. The flavor was unlike anything she'd expected, layered and complex, with a surprising hint of sweetness that lingered. The next morning, she placed the experimental pastries on display alongside her usual offerings. At first, no one took much notice, but as soon as the first customer tried one, word spread quickly. People began to crowd the bakery, some even asking if the recipe was her grandmother's. Grace simply smiled, pleased but slightly overwhelmed as more and more people poured in, eager for a taste. By the end of the week, the bakery was buzzing with new business. Each day, she saw fresh faces, drawn in by whispers about the magical pastries. Grace felt a surge of pride and relief. She was finally making her mark, and it felt like a piece of her grandmother's spirit was guiding her. But just as Grace began to feel a sense of accomplishment, a shadow fell over her excitement. One afternoon, a regular customer mentioned that a new bakery had opened a few blocks away. They're calling themselves Willow Sweets and claim they're offering a modern twist on traditional recipes, the customer said with a sly look. Bit of a coincidence, don't you think? Grace's heart sank. The timing was suspicious, and as the days passed, the competition grew fierce. She started noticing her pastries being copied, her signature flavor combinations replicated with an unsettling familiarity. Rumors circulated that the rival bakery's owner, a slick young entrepreneur named Lila, had been scouting Grace's shop, watching her work from afar. Lila wasn't subtle about her intentions. One morning, Grace glanced up from the counter to see Lila standing outside, watching her through the glass with a knowing smirk. Grace's stomach twisted. She felt like her grandmother's legacy was slipping away, piece by piece, to this stranger who was intent on turning Grace's hard-won success into her own advantage. With sales dipping as customers wandered over to the rival bakery, Grace felt the familiar pangs of doubt return. She considered cutting costs or even halting her experiments with the secret recipe. But as she stood in the quiet bakery one night, flipping through the recipe book, she found a new line she hadn't noticed before: true magic isn't in ingredients, but in heart. Taking a steadying breath, Grace realized her grandmother had left her more than just recipes. She had left Grace her spirit, her resilience. The competition was fierce, yes, but this was her bakery, her home. Lila could mimic the pastries, but she couldn't mimic the heart behind them. Armed with fresh determination, Grace spent the next few days creating an entirely new batch of pastries, focusing on quality, warmth, and flavors that evoked memories of her grandmother. She wrote a small note on each pastry bag, a personal message about her grandmother's love for the town and its people. Each bag became a reminder of the bakery's roots. Slowly, the customers began returning, drawn not just by the pastries but by Grace's story. They weren't just buying baked goods, they were supporting a legacy, a piece of Willow Creek history. Grace's days began before dawn and ended long after the stars had appeared. She'd risen early to prepare the pastries, worked through the bustling crowds, and spent late evenings experimenting with new recipes to stay ahead of the competition. Her life had become a blur of flour-dusted mornings, endless cups of coffee, and the ever-present aroma of warm vanilla and spices. And while the success of the bakery was undeniable, it had come at a cost. Her friends and family had become distant memories, their invitations and calls fading as she pushed herself further into her work. She skipped meals, rarely slept, and felt herself growing thinner and paler with each passing day. Still, she dismissed the nagging aches and the constant exhaustion as minor inconveniences. She told herself she could handle it, that this was the price of keeping her grandmother's bakery alive. One rainy afternoon, Grace's exhaustion caught up with her. She stumbled slightly as she set a tray of pastries on the counter, her vision blurring for a split second. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her brow furrowed with concern as she handed over her usual bag of pastries. Grace forced a smile, brushing off the comment. "Just a long day. Nothing I'm not used to." She waved goodbye, hoping her voice sounded stronger than she felt. But as the door shut behind Mrs. Thompson, Grace sank against the counter, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath to steady herself. She was teetering on the edge, and she knew it. Later that evening, as she was cleaning up, the bell above the door chimed. She looked up surprised to see Lila, her rival from Willow Sweets, standing in the doorway. Dressed impeccably in designer clothes, Lila looked every bit the polished businesswoman, her lips curving into a smirk as she surveyed the bakery. "Evening, Grace," Lila said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She strolled to the counter, eyeing the pastries with a disapproving tilt of her head. "You're doing well here. I hear people talking about your secret recipe all over town." Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral, unwilling to give Lila the satisfaction of a reaction. "Good for business," Grace replied evenly. Lila's smile widened, and she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Word is, it's an old family recipe. The kind people guard with their lives." Grace's throat tightened. Lila's words carried an undercurrent of threat that sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to ask how much Lila knew, how far she'd gone to dig into her family's secrets, but she resisted. She simply nodded. "Every family has its traditions." Lila's eyes gleamed. "Well, rumor has it, that family recipe of yours is quite interesting. And I should tell you, Grace, rumors spread fast." She straightened, giving Grace a final smirk before she turned and sauntered out, leaving Grace frozen in place, her mind racing. Days later, Grace found herself scrambling to keep up with orders as the bakery's reputation soared. She hadn't slept properly since Lila's visit, her nerves on edge as she worried about what her rival might do next. Lila's vague threat hung over her like a storm cloud, one that seemed poised to break at any moment. Then came the invitation. A notice arrived in her mail for the Willow Creek Annual Bake-Off, a prestigious local competition that her grandmother had won years before, earning her the initial fame that had made the bakery beloved in town. But this time, it was clear Lila had something to do with the invite, as a sticky note on the envelope read, "Looking forward to seeing if the hype is real." Grace's first instinct was to refuse, but she quickly reconsidered. The competition could be an opportunity to prove that her pastries were special, even without her grandmother's secret recipe. And if Lila did have a copy of the recipe, as Grace now suspected, then this competition might force her hand. In the days leading up to the bake-off, Grace felt like she was on a knife's edge. Each night, she revisited her grandmother's recipe, adjusting it subtly, adding her own flourishes. She told herself she could show everyone her skills without relying on the family secret, but deep down, she knew that part of her feared failing. If she couldn't win on her own, would all her hard work be for nothing? The day of the competition arrived, and Grace found herself standing behind a counter in the bustling event hall, her heart pounding. She took in the scene: rows of tables covered in flour and butter, pastry bags and rolling pins, judges examining every detail with eagle-eyed scrutiny. And just across from her, Lila was setting up, her eyes gleaming with a confidence that made Grace's stomach twist. When the signal to begin sounded, Grace focused on her station, blocking out the noise of the crowd. She prepared her ingredients with precision, her hands moving with practiced ease. But as she worked, she noticed Lila watching her, a gleam in her eyes as if she were waiting for Grace to slip up. Halfway through the competition, Grace reached for the last of her key ingredients, only to find it missing. Her eyes darted around her station, panic rising as she realized that someone must have tampered with her setup. Her gaze snapped to Lila, who gave her a small, satisfied smile before turning back to her own work. Desperation clawed at Grace's chest. She couldn't let Lila sabotage her, not after everything she'd fought for. Summoning every ounce of courage, Grace decided to improvise, relying on memory and instinct to recreate the taste she had come to know so well. As the clock wound down, Grace plated her pastries, her hands steady despite the tension simmering beneath her skin. She placed them in front of the judges, offering a quiet prayer that they would taste not just the flavors, but the care, the history, and the love she had poured into them. One by one, the judges tasted the entries, their expressions thoughtful. When they reached Grace's, she held her breath, watching every flicker of reaction. A few murmured, nodding with approval, and one judge even closed his eyes as he took a second bite. Finally, it was time for the results. Grace and Lila stood side by side as the lead judge stepped forward, holding an envelope with the winner's name. Grace's pulse roared in her ears as he opened it, pausing for effect. The winner of this year's bake-off, for her unique and unforgettable pastries, is Grace from Willow Bakery. A wave of relief and joy crashed over her, and she felt tears prick her eyes. She'd done it, on her terms, with her hands, her heart. The crowd erupted into applause as Grace stepped forward, accepting the award with a grateful smile. Lila's face was a mask of shock, and for once, she had nothing to say. As Grace looked out at the cheering crowd, she felt her grandmother's presence, a warm memory enveloping her like a hug. She had not just saved her grandmother's bakery, she had given it new life, a future that was hers to shape. As she returned to her station, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the bakery's story wasn't just about secrets or recipes, it was about resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond of family. With or without her grandmother's recipe, she would continue the legacy, one pastry at a time. With a deep breath, Grace stood up before the judges and audience. The soft murmur of voices gradually quieted as she raised her hand. She caught sight of Lila, her face twisted in surprise, and Grace couldn't help but smile. This was her choice, not a move forced by competition or fear. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Many of you know I inherited Willow Bakery from my grandmother, who loved this town and loved every person who walked through her doors. What you might not know is that I've been using one of her hidden recipes, a recipe she cherished. But to truly honor her memory, I want to share that secret with all of you today, along with the story that goes with it." The audience leaned forward, curiosity flashing in their eyes. Grace could see familiar faces from her childhood, along with the loyal customers who had come to the bakery for decades. These were people who had tasted her grandmother's love baked into every pastry, and she wanted them to feel that same warmth now. "She used to call it her gift recipe," Grace said, her voice softening. "When I was little, I'd watch her make it only for special occasions, birthdays, weddings, sometimes just because she sensed someone was having a hard day. She believed that sharing food was sharing love, that a meal could heal even the deepest sadness. That's why she kept it a secret, not to keep it from anyone, but to make it special, to make people feel seen and cherished." A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd, and Grace felt her own heart swell as she spoke. "Today, I've decided that my grandmother's gift shouldn't be kept to myself. I want everyone here to have a piece of her, to know the magic she put into every batch. I'm sharing her secret recipe, but I'm also sharing a bit of my heart. Willow Bakery belongs to all of us." She then walked to the judges' table, handing each a card with the carefully written recipe. The first judge took it with a nod of respect, his face softening as he read. She offered copies to anyone in the audience who wanted it, explaining the special touches her grandmother had added and how each ingredient had its purpose and place. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Customers and neighbors approached her, some with teary smiles, others with warm hugs and grateful words. By openly sharing the recipe, Grace had bridged the gap between her grandmother's traditions and her own vision. The community embraced her wholeheartedly, no longer seeing her as just the new face of the bakery, but as a true part of the town's legacy. The bakery quickly became a local sensation, the gift recipe pastries selling out daily. But Grace didn't stop there. She began experimenting with new flavors and ideas, blending her grandmother's recipes with her own creations. She introduced fresh twists on traditional pastries, using seasonal ingredients and local flavors, and every week featured a community special, inspired by ideas from customers themselves. A few months later, on a warm spring afternoon, Grace decided to host a grand reopening celebration, inviting the whole town to join in an afternoon of music, laughter, and food. As people filed into the bakery, Grace could see the delight on their faces as they took in the cheerful decorations, the smell of freshly baked goods, and the familiar warmth of her grandmother's legacy, now intertwined with her own creativity. There was a special table set up for tasting, featuring a mix of her grandmother's original pastries and Grace's new inventions. The centerpiece was a batch of the gift recipe pastries, freshly baked and dusted with powdered sugar. Grace's heart swelled as she watched people enjoy the treats, sharing stories and laughter. Halfway through the event, Grace noticed a familiar face entering the bakery. Lila, looking less polished than usual, her expression softened as she took in the scene. Grace was surprised, but she smiled and waved her over, extending an olive branch. Lila hesitated, then approached, glancing at the treats on display. "I didn't expect this," she admitted, her voice tinged with surprise. Grace shrugged lightly. "It turns out the best way to protect a legacy is to share it. My grandmother's recipes aren't mine alone. They belong to everyone who loved her." Lila nodded thoughtfully, her posture relaxing. "Maybe I was wrong to try and compete. You're not just running a bakery, you're bringing people together. That's powerful." They stood in silence for a moment, then Grace offered Lila one of the gift recipe pastries. "Here, try it. I think you'll understand." Lila accepted, taking a careful bite, her eyes widening slightly as the flavors settled. It really is special." Grace chuckled. "It's not magic. Just love and a little bit of trust." As the evening sun began to set, Grace looked around the bakery, watching her friends, family, and community gathered in one joyful celebration. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a certainty that her grandmother's legacy would continue not only in recipes but in the spirit of giving and connection. Later that night, as she was cleaning up, she couldn't help but smile at a new idea forming in her mind, a line of unique pastries inspired by her neighbors' stories. Every treat would tell a tale, something personal and heartfelt, just like her grandmother would have wanted. With the bakery filled with laughter, food, and love, Grace knew that this was only the beginning of something truly special. And as she shut off the lights and closed the door behind her, she could almost hear her grandmother's gentle voice, proud and warm, whispering, "This is your story now. Share it well. Thanks for watching. How would you rate this story? Give it 1 to 5 hearts in the comments and let me know what you thought. This is a brand new channel, and your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your likes, comments, and shares help this community grow, and I'd be so grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.